Greetings, my friends. It is almost magic hour of 7 p.m. And tonight we have a very special program for you. Tonight is Christmas Eve, 2022. It is almost 7 o'clock. We have about a minute to go. And it is a very, very important time during the Revolutionary War when they fought the final victorious battle over the British and King George. So tonight what we're going to do is a full program for you. This is the Patriot version of a Christmas Eve program. So you're going to get all kinds of stuff in this program here. And we're going to start off with, twas the night before Christmas, but this is the Flavor Flav version. This is Willis's version of the night before Christmas in regard to the Revolutionary War. So I wrote a poem for that. And then we're going to read the actual story of the Revolutionary War on Christmas Eve night, what our American Revolutionary War soldiers went through just to get the win, and all the behind the scenes things that no one knows about. And I made from the book called 1776 by David McCullough. And it's the most succinct book that was written about the Revolutionary War, where David McCullough just took the highlights of the Revolutionary War. Because if you look at the bibliography in the back of the book, you'll see he way over this book, because he went deep into the annals of our true history of our country. So, and then before that, though, we got to pay the bills. So what we're going to do is, this is the Circle of Willis podcast and the Podcast for Freedom YouTube channel. We also broadcast on Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, and there's one other one. But what I most want you to think about for tonight is, I'd like you to consider taking a common law course with the Willis School of Freedom. And what you do is go to patreon.com. It's Patreon, Patreon.com, and go to and search the Willis School of Freedom and start walking your path to freedom by taking a common law course. Coming up in January. In January, we have two ways to take the course. One is an class. We meet online a couple times. We'll go over the books, discuss and ask questions and answer questions. But also, too, we will have a video course where you can go through the course as fast as you choose and be a self-study kind of thing. So those are coming up. So please go to patreon.com, search for the Willis School of Freedom, and click the green button and join us. And that's what you need to do, so that way we can start walking our pathway. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start out with a little bit of Revolutionary War history. Now, this is cool because I was looking up the songs from the Revolutionary War, and, of course, Yankee Doodle comes up. Now, I want to give you the history of Yankee Doodle because it's quite funny. Yankee Doodle. Every American school child learns the tune of Yankee Doodle before they leave elementary school, but few people know the origins of the song. Some of the words are, Yankee Doodle went town riding on a pony, in his hat and called it macaroni. Now, the British named Richard Shuckburgh first penned verses during the French and Indian War, son of colonial soldiers. He used a traditional British tune, which had been attached to many other lyrics, but in modern times, Yankee Doodle has become the most famous. Yankee was a derogatory term attached to others. Now, that's the history. That's the true history of Yankee. It didn't have to do with our Southern brothers. It has to do with the New Englanders. And in those days, macaroni wasn't a noodle, but it was a foppish or effeminate hairstyle. And guess what hairstyle most patriots wore? They wore a ponytail behind their head. And in the tune, Shuckburgh was basically calling the colonists unmanly and stupid, yet the colonists loved the song so much that they adopted it, one of their most patriotic songs. and would make captured British prisoners dance at the end of the Revolutionary War. So just like most American patriots do, somebody calls us and we turn it around and we use it for entertainment. So that's just what we do. The other song get into tonight, but you might want to look it up. The song is called Chester, and that was for the Patriots. And so that's a little bit of history of the music behind the Revolutionary War, just to set the stage. All right, so next what we're going to do, I'm going to read my rendition of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" from 1705, because you see 1775 was fought the Revolutionary War Christmas Eve. So this is written during the Christmas era, during the Revolutionary War of 1775. And here we go. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the land patriots were stirring, and General George Washington had a plan. The patriots' stockings were wet as they marched through the night, as the British and the Hessians drunk and all snug in their beds, while visions of patriots' heads on spikes danced in their heads. The soldiers in their tri-cornered hat had just settled in for a midnight moonlight march to the Delaware." Who says this has to rhyme, right? Okay. "When on the other side of the Delaware River, there a ladder, the Patriot Army stopped cold to see what was the matter. They looked across the Delaware to see the high fires of the British and the Hessians, drinking and reveling, but they did not see the flash of the Patriot rifles or cannons. The moon on the breast and snow gave the lustre day to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but 23-year-old General Nathaniel Greene and his 8 80-pound cannons pulled by horses like reindeer. The cannons were being driven so lively and quick by big stallion horses with names like Nick-Nick. The cannons they came, and General Greene cawed and whistled, and he called those cannons by name. Now Virginia, Massachusetts, now Rhode Island, now Connecticut, New Hampshire, on New York, Jersey, on Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, and North Carolina, and South Carolina, and Georgia. To the front of the boats and over the Delaware, dash away, dash away, dash away all. And as dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle and mount to the sky, so across the Delaware River they cruised with the boats, full of patriots and General George Washington too. And then twinkling, I heard on the shore the prancing and pawing of each horse's hoof, as I drew in my hand and affixed my bayonet and was turning around. Up the bank came General George Washington on his white steed abound. He was dressed all in wool from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with snow and with mud. His rapier was drawn, and he was ready for action. He led the soldiers creeping quietly toward the British distraction. His eyes, how they twinkle, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow as he anticipated the surprise of his foe. Stump of a cigar he held in his wooden teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. And he had a broad face and a serious look, anticipating the shock he would give to King George that he took. He was tall and muscular and had a menacing figure. He had earned his title of general and would now stand and deliver. A wink of his eyes and the raising of his saber meant courage and energized their labor. They spoke not a word, but went and took their bayonets and put them at the throats of the drunk British and Hessians. They captured the British army and made them surrender. We are Americans. This is our land. And back to Britain, you be sundered. And we heard them exclaim as they drove those British dogs out of sight. Merry Christmas to all. We give you your freedom. It is our birthright. And to all, a good night. So inspiration, I took, it was the night before Christmas because George Washington didn't have a nice home with a warm fire in the Christmas Eve of 1775. He and his men were going through the snow. And as we start the reading here shortly, you'll find out how. But this is just perfect for Christmas Eve night and Patriots. So I'm going to keep right on a rocking. Okay, now this book, which is 76 by David McCullough, if you have a chance to get it on Amazon. I mean, the book is older. Let's see when it was written real quick. I've had it for a while, and I read it all. As you can see, I've got tons of earmarked pages. It was written in, let's see, 2005. So it's pretty old. All right, here we go. Gather your hot cup of cocoa or your tea. And this is also what we're going to do. This will be made into a video and sent to everyone I know. So if you want a copy of this video to share with your family, send me an email to gwashington1636@gmail. gwashington1636@gmail, and I will happily send you a video. And everybody should hear it. Review of history. Okay, here we go. On Sunday morning, December 1st, with and Hessian columns advancing on Brunswick, 2,000 New Jersey and Maryland militia walked away from the war. And without apology, 2 brigades left us at Brunswick, wrote Nathaniel Greene, quote, notwithstanding the enemy or with 2 hours march and coming, quote, Washington sent off summons to Lee to come with all speed, quote, or your arrival may be too late for any valuable purpose. The enemy are fast approaching. He reported it in a hurried dispatch to Jeff, noting that the time was half past 1. Some of them are in sight. He ordered the only bridge, Raritan at Brunswick, destroyed. And this had been largely, the river was fordable. In some places only knee deep, and as he also took Hancock, mincing no words, his present force was totally inadequate to stop the enemy. The first of the British artillery arrived at the river, and by late afternoon, British and American cannon were exchanging fire. The American guns commanded by young Captain Alexander Hamilton. But again, as at Newark, when troops pressed on to town morning, they found that the Americans had taken off. Washington had to be done. He was heading for Trenton. It is being impossible to oppose them with our present force. With the least possible prospect of success, he informed Congress, we shall retreat to the west bank of the Delaware. Retweet. I like that. I'm learning new words here tonight. Okay, so we're not retweeting, we're retreating. Sorry. I just thought that was funny. We left Brunswick, wrote Nathaniel Greene, 1,000 men. A very pitiful army to trust the liberties of America on. The hour had never looked darker. Post Road, or King's Highway, from Brunswick to Trenton, the main thoroughfare between New York and Philadelphia. Hang on. Was as straight and a 30-mile stretch of road as any in the country, and the retreating army made good time. The retreat was not at a run. It was a forced march, not a rout, as sometimes portrayed. Washington and the main body marching through the night reached Trenton, Delaware, the morning of December 2nd, having Lord Surrey and 2 brigades as a rear guard at the little college town of Princeton. Orders were issued to round up all the boats east bank of the Delaware and destroy any that could not be used, to keep them out of enemy hands. Among the delegates to Congress, the distances from Brunswick to Trenton and Trenton to Philadelphia were well known. And so if Cornwallis was at Brunswick, then he and his army were a mere 60 miles from Philadelphia. The inhabitants of Princeton and Trenton are evacuated, wrote Massachusetts delegate Robert Treat Payne. The people left night with panic precipitation. People in Philadelphia were getting out too, many taking possessions they could carry. Numbers of families loading wagons, the citizen recorded. All shops ordered shut. People in confusion of all ranks. The great question on everybody's mind was, where was Lee and his men? It was said they were not far, close in the rear of the enemy, but no one knew. I have not heard a word from General Lee since the 26th of last month, John Hancock read in a letter from Washington dated December 3rd. With his brothers, Sir William's campaign seeding splendidly in New Jersey, or rapidly losing some more support among the people there, Admiral Lord Howe, he's British, decided to get another appeal for conciliation. Signed also by Sir William, the new proclamation was their boldest, most generous gesture thus far, they felt. It was issued in the spirit of their obligation as commissioned by the king to serve as peace negotiators as well as military commanders, but also because Lord Howe believed that a negotiated settlement with the Americans was yet possible and vastly preferable to a long drawn-out conflict. He had no desire to lose any more British lives or to inflict any more destruction and suffering on the Americans than necessary. The proclamation dated November 30th was an immediate success. It offered all who within 60 days would come forth and take an oath of allegiance to the king and pledge their peaceable obedience in general pardon, and that they would reap the benefit of his mass paternal goodness in the preservation of their property, the restoration of their commerce, and the security of their most valuable rights under the just and most moderate authority of the crown of the Parliament of Britain. Hundreds, eventually thousands in New Jersey flocked to the British camp to declare their loyalty. Considering the way the war was going, the size and might of the British army, and the pathetic state of Washington's meager band, it seemed the prudent thing to do. As a farmer near Brunswick named John Bray wrote to a kinsman, "You can come down and receive and return home with molestation on the part of the king's troops. And you best know the situation of the provincial army. Do advise Cousin Johnny and Thomas and Cousin Thomas Jones, for if they do stay out, they will undoubtedly fare the worst." Having crossed the Raritan and occupied on December 1st, Cornwallis called a halt as he had been ordered by General Howe. For 6 days, 6 merciful days for Washington, the British and the Hessians made no move. A decision that puzzled and even infuriated many British and local loyalists who saw no reason to let up on the chase. Called on to explain later, Cornwallis would say his troops exhausted, footsore, hungry, and in need of rest. More important, it had not seemed at the time pace was wise or necessary. There were dangers in too rapid a pursuit. He worried about General Lee, was variously reported just ahead or coming up from behind, but like he would catch Washington, Cornwallis said. He would go going whatever the risk, no matter what the orders. Some would see the pause as a horrendous blunder and blame William Howe, Captain Charles Stead, Cornwallis's own officer, and the earliest British historian of the war would speculate that had Cornwallis been allowed to act on discretion, he would have pursued the weakened and alarmed to the Delaware, over which, without falling into his hands, they never could have passed. Assumed that Washington and the army could not have escaped down on the east side of the river, which seems unreasonable. The Hessians officer, Johann Ewald, an intelligent and experienced soldier, concluded that Cornwallis had no desire for valuable troops and needless jeopardy. On the night of the capture of Fort Lee, his jaggers had started after a column of rebels retreating in a cloud of dust, Cornwallis had ordered them back. "Let them go, my dear Ewald, and stay here," Cornwallis had said. "We do not want to lose any men. One Jagger is worth more than tails. By the time of Halter's work, Ewald wrote, the hope of the whole British command was of ending the war amicably without shedding the blood of the king's subjects in a needless way. Others would say it were political reasons related to the latest peace move that conventionally let Washington get away. No one would ever prove this, and it seems unlikely, especially since General Howe, sensing that a final blow struck, arrived at Brunswick on December 6th with an additional brigade, commanded Grant, and ordered the advance to continue at once. The weather had turned unreasonably warm, ideal for campaigning. A loyalist newspaper in New York had already set the scene in a report published the day before. It is said by some persons who have lately seen the rebel forces that they're the most pitiful collection of ragged, dispirited mortals that ever pretended to the name of an army, and that if the weather continues fair but a little longer, there is no visible impediment to His Majesty's troops completing a march to the capital of Pennsylvania. Everything seemed the advantage of the conquering British army. All was going as wished, except for one vexing problem that had been growing steadily worse for several weeks. Marauding, pillaging by redcoats and Hessians had gotten out of hand. Scandalous behavior for British troops, wrote Major Stephen Kemble, the loyalist serving with the British Army, and the Hessians outrageously, senselessly, and cruel to such a disgrace as to threaten with death all such who dare obstruct them in their depredations. Kemble had recorded this in his early November before the capture of Washington. I shudder for New Jersey, he had written. The plenty of New Jersey, the guard of America, its broad, fertile, and well-tended farms, abundant supplies of livestock, grain, hay, for barrels of wine, and beer for the taking, were all too much to resist. And the First Nation troops set foot in New Jersey, Captain Ewald wrote, all the plantations in the vicinity were plundered, and whatever the soldiers found in the houses were declared booty. Ewald appalled by what he saw. On this march through New Jersey, we looked upon a deplorable sight. The region is well cultivated with very attractive plantations, but all the occupants had fled, and the houses had been or were being plundered and destroyed. The British blamed the Hessians. The Hessians are more infamous than any, wrote Ambrose Searle after hearing reports of British plundering. The Hessians blamed the British, as well as the New Jersey Loyalists. And British and the Hessians commanders seemed no more able to put a stop to such excesses than Washington had been. These, amplified as many may have been, were a searing part of a war that seemed to only grow more brutal and destructive. Accounts of houses sacked, robbed of all they had, became commonplace. American reports of atrocities were often, but many were also quite accurate. The Pennsylvania Journal, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, and the Freeman's Journal carried reports of the sick and elderly being abused, of rape and murder. No one was safe, according to the British officer Charles Stedman, from the land of rapine shared alike. The New Jersey Loyalists were the most villainous of all, Nathaniel Greene reported to his wife, Katie. They had the relentless foreigners to the house of their neighbors and stripped poor women and children of everything they have to eat or to wear. And after plundering them in this sort, the brutes often ravish the mother's daughters and compel the fathers and sons to behold the brutality. Enemies' ravages in New Jersey exceeded all description. Governor Nick Cook of Rhode Island, many hundred women ravished. Newark, according to the report of a congressional committee, 3 women who was in her 70s, another pregnant, were horribly ravished. Fear and outrage spread across New Jersey and beyond. Their footsteps are marked with destruction wherever they go. Greene said of the enemy, what remained of Washington's army, the Shadow Army, as he called it, was pitiful to behold. But give me leave to tell you, sir, Greene would write to John Adams, that our difficulties were inconceivable who were not eyewitnesses to them. British and Hessian forces got underway from Brunswick on December 7th and came on faster than ever. William Howe, having decided that the possession of Trenton was extremely desirable, with the continuing success of the proclamation of November 30th and hardly any opposition from the rebels. Howe intended to secure another large part of New Jersey where loyalists were plentiful, and where, as he also said, Philadelphia was an easy striking distance. Washington was on his way from Trenton to look things over at Princeton when he received word of the enemy's strength and rapid advance. Immediately, he turned back. Our retreat should not be neglected for fear of consequences, advised Daniel Greene, who had also ridden to Princeton earlier in the day. In the trek across New Jersey, had become increasingly dependent on Greene, but it was beyond doubt that the enemy was advancing, Greene reported. Lord Stirling expected them by noon. Lee was also said to be at the heels of the enemy, but Greene cautioned Washington, saying that whatever happened, Lee ought to be kept under control within the lines of some general plan, or else is independent of yours. Washington had already made his decision, and he calmly, deliberately carried it out. A fleet of boats was standing ready. By nightfall, the weary troops and their commander were crossing the Delaware-Pennsylvania shore, where bonfires had been set ablaze to light the way. One of those watching from the Pennsylvania side was the artist Charles Wilson Peale, who had arrived with a Philadelphia militia unit in answer to Washington's call for help. Peale wrote later of the firelight on the river and the shore of boats laden with soldiers, horses, cannons, and equipment, of men calling out orders. It was a grand but spectacle. The hallooing of hundreds of men and their difficulties getting horses and artillery out of the boats made it rather the appearance of hell than any earthly scene. The long retreat that had begun in New York and continued from the Hudson to the Delaware was over. Casualties had been few in New Jersey, and its pitiable appearance and miseries notwithstanding, the army, or the semblance of the army, had once again survived. With a handful of men, we sustained an orderly retreat, wrote Thomas Paine in The Crisis, which soon appeared in Philadelphia. No sign of fear was to be seen, he insisted. Once more, we are collected and collecting. By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious issue. Henry Knox, writing on the morning of the December 8th, his first letter to his wife in weeks, said she might be surprised he was in Pennsylvania. Though physically exhausted, he, like Paine, refused to be downcast. It was a combination of unlucky circumstances that had brought things to such a pass, he told her. We are now making a stand on the side of the Delaware toward Philadelphia. And the truth, men were dreadfully dispirited. Many had given up, and in addition to the 2,000 who had refused to sign on again after December 1st, hundreds had deserted. Many of them were left sick, hungry, altogether as miserable as they appeared. To Charles Hill, walking among them by the light of the next morning on the Pennsylvania shore, they looked as wretched as any men he had ever seen. One had almost no clothes. He was in an old dirt jacket, his beard long and his face so full of sores that he could not clean it. So disfigured was he that Peale failed at first to recognize that the man was his own brother. Sorry. Who had been with Maryland unit as part of the rear guard. And we sit today and bitch and moan how bad we got it. And this is our forefathers, our foremothers, and the price they paid for our freedom. I apologize, but sometimes it's overwhelming. Onward. That the enemy, okay, so disfigured was he that Peale failed to recognize that the man was his own James Peale, who had been with a Maryland unit as part of their guard. That the enemy might cross Delaware at one or several points and move quickly to seize Philadelphia, New York, no one doubted on Washington's orders. Every boat not commanded to bring the army across had been destroyed. For 60 miles along the east bank of the river, which was no small accomplishment. But broad and soft as it was, the river would remain a barrier to Howe only so long as Washington warned the members of Congress repeatedly in a series of urgent dispatches. From several accounts, I'm led to think that the army are bringing boats with them, he wrote. If so, it will be impossible for our small force to give them any considerable opposition on the passage of the river. Under the circumstances, the security of Philadelphia should be our next object. another letter to Hancock, he stated flatly that Philadelphia, beyond all question, is of the enemy's movements, that nothing less than our utmost exertions could stop Howe, and that his own force was too thin and weak to count on. Washington and his staff had taken up quarters in a brick house directly across the river from Trenton, where he hoped to keep watch on the enemy. His troops were scattered close by the river for miles, camped in the woods, and brushed out of sight from the river. The greater part of them about 10 miles to the north of Washington's headquarters. Suck it. I got something in my eye, and it's not a tear. This is what you get with live performances. All right. While Joseph Reed, with his recruiting efforts in New Jersey, Mifflin's efforts had produced some results. The Philadelphia Volunteer Militia, or Philadelphia Associators, as they were so called, that Charles Wilson Peel had arrived with number 1,000 and marched into camp in a very spirited manner as Washington's mood improved. On December 10th, word came to Lee at last that Lee had 4,000 troops commanded by General Sullivan had reached Morristown to the northeast. General Lee is on a march to join me, Washington wrote to the governor of Connecticut, Jonathan Turnbull. If he can't effect this junction, our army again will make a respectable appearance. And as such, I hope will disappoint the army in their plan on Philadelphia. Everything depended on Lee. And the letter to Trump was written on December 14th when Washington knew nothing of the events of the day before, Friday the 13th. Events wholly unexpected and of far-reaching consequences. As time would show, that Friday the 13th had been an exceedingly lucky day for Washington and for his country. For our country. Oh, look at that. There we go. An inexplicable lapse of judgment. General Lee had spent the previous night of the 12th separated from his troops, miles away at Basking Ridge. For what reason is not known. With Lee was a personal guard of 15 officers and men. The next morning, in low spirits and in no apparent hurry, Lee sat at a table in his dressing gown, attending to routine paperwork. Then took time to write a letter to General Gates for no other purpose than to blame Washington for all his troubles and for the woeful state of affairs in general. Entre nous, a certain great man is a damnable defiant, Lee told Gates. He has thus thrown me into a situation where I have my choice of difficulties. If I stay in this province, I risk myself and the army. And if I do not stay, the province is lost forever. In short, unless something which I do not expect turns up, we are lost. It was just after 10 when British cavalry appeared suddenly at Lane. They were a scouting party of 25 horsemen, commanded by Colonel William Harcourt, who had once served under Lee in Portugal. They had been seen out by Trenton by Cornwallis to gather intelligence on Lee's motions and situation. At Basking Ridge, local loyalists had given them the answer. From the end, a distance of about 100 yards, 6 of the horsemen, led by Lieutenant Bannister Tarleton, came. In minutes, they had laid the building surrounded, killed 2 of the guards, and scattered the rest. I ordered my men to fire into the house through every window and door and cut up as many of the guard as they could, Tarleton later wrote. Some of those inside fired back. Then the owner of the tavern, a woman named White, appeared to the door, screaming that Lee was. She begged for mercy. Tarleton shouted that he would burn the building, gave himself up. In a few minutes, Lee appeared and surrendered, saying he trusted he would be treated as a gentleman. A young American lieutenant, been inside, managed to escape. James Wilkinson later described how a cheer went out among Lee's captors and a trumpet sounded. Then off they dashed with their prize, and at Lee, hatless, still in his dressing gown and slippers, and Wilkinson's horse, which happened to have been tethered at the door. The astonishing raid had taken no more than 15 minutes. These captures spread in all directions. As the fast horses could move, the British were jubilant. At Brunswick, where the prisoner was put under lock, cavalrymen celebrated by getting Lee's horse, drunk, along with themselves, as a band played into the night. A Hessian captain wrote in his journal, "We have captured General Lee, the only rebel general whom we had cause to fear." The hero of the hour, Lieutenant Tarleton, wrote triumphantly to his mother, "This coup de main has put an end to this campaign." When the news reached England, it was thought at first to be too improbable, then set off bell ringing and joyful demonstrations as if a great battle had been won. Among the British, it was thought that because Lee was a British soldier and a gentleman, he was therefore, of course, superior to any raw American provincial who had assumed high rank. But then for the same, also that much more of a traitor to his king. To the American officers and troops deployed along the west bank of the Delaware, and all whose hopes were riding on them, the loss of Lee seemed to be the worst possible moment. To Nathanael Greene, it was one of a combination of evils pressing in upon us on all sides. Washington on Friday, what had happened, he called it a severe blow. Then he said he would comment no further on this unhappy accident. Privately, he was furious with Lee for having been such a fool, unhappy man taken by his own imprudence. He told Lund, Washington, and privately, he must also have breathed a sigh of relief after the continuing frustrations and anxieties Lee had subjected him to. There must have been a feast for Washington. The popular, egotistical general who considered the members of Congress no better than cattle and longed for the necessary to set everything straight was no longer a factor. In little time, fearing he might be hanged as a traitor and hoping to ingratiate himself with his old military friend William Howe, Lee would resort to offering his thoughts to Howe on ways the British could win the war. The same day as Lee's capture, Washington learned that Congress had adjourned in order to move to a safer location in Baltimore, abandoning Philadelphia for the first time since for the first Continental Congress in 1774. Everything seemed to be happening at once. On December 13th, at his Trenton headquarters across the river from Washington, William Howe made one of the faithful decisions of the war. He was suspending further military operations until spring. Beginning immediately, he and his army would retire to winter quarters in northern New Jersey and New York to secure the ground gained in the campaign. He would establish a string of outposts in New Jersey. There had been a change in weather. The days had turned much colder. The nights were the coldest yet, with a hard frost and snow flurries, and this was all Howe needed in his mind. The weather having become too severe to keep the field. It was commonly understood that 18th century professional armies and their general commanders subject themselves to the miseries of winter campaigns, unless there were overriding reasons to the contrary. Considering all he had accomplished in one year's campaign and knowing the helpless state of Howe saw no cause to continue the fight or to remain a day longer than was necessary in punishing American women in a place like Trenton. And there they were, besides compelling reasons to retire to New York City for quarters of the army and for the comforts and pleasures that so appealed to the general himself. Howe departed for New York Saturday, December 14th, joined by Cornwallis, whom he had granted leave to return to England to visit his ailing wife. General Howe, cozily in New York, as pictured in the minds of many, would rekindle old gossip and to some popular dud. Sir William, he, snug as a flea, lay all his time a foreign, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed. No be built or hauled overland by the British to cross the Delaware. And for now, there was to be no march in Philadelphia. The members of it could as well have stayed where they were. But of this, Washington seems to have known little or nothing. Close as he was to the enemy, he had almost no idea of what they were doing, no knowledge that Howe and Cornwallis had departed, and that neither he nor Congress were any longer under immediate threat. The Delaware now divides what remains of our little force from that of General, whose object, beyond all question, is to possess Philadelphia, Washington wrote on December 18th, 4 days after, to James Bowdoin, a member of the Massachusetts Council. Were the river to freeze, Washington feared, the enemy might attack over the ice, strain every nerve for carrying out the necessary works. Putnam, who was charged with the defense of Philadelphia. There seems to be the strongest reason to believe the enemy will attempt to pass the river as soon as the ice is sufficiently formed. Desperate for reliable intelligence, for information of almost any, Washington let it be known he was willing to pay for it at almost any price. In a dispatch to his general officers, he implored them to find a spot who would cross the river and determine whether any boats were being built or land. Expense must not be spared in procuring such intelligence and will readily be paid by me. To Lord Stirling, he wrote, use every possible means without regard to expense to come with certainty at the enemy's strength, situation, and movements. Without this, we wander wilderness of uncertainties. As early as December 15th, he had received a report from a commander of Pennsylvania militia posted below Trenton, John Cadwalader, saying General Howe is certainly gone to unless the whole is a scheme to amuse and surprise. Perhaps Washington found it or suspected that it was indeed a ruse. Whatever the reason, he seemed to have ignored it. The foe gathered on the other side of the river was the British Army, no longer holding force of 1,500, settled in for the winter under the command of Colonel John Rall, the veteran officer who had led the fierce Hessian assaults at White Plains and Fort Washington. Learned about the apparent designs of the enemy, the wilderness of uncertainties, Washington moved his headquarters 10 miles upstream to Buckingham Township, closer to the main body of the army where Greene, Sterling, and Knox had their headquarters. In 2 weeks, on New Year's Day, all enlistments would expire. And what then? Only dependence now is upon the speedy enlistment of a new army, he wrote to Lund, Washington. If this fails, I think the game is pretty near up. On December 20th, in the midst of a snowstorm, General Sullivan at the head of Lee's troops, having marched at a pace 4 times what Lee had set in order to join Washington as soon as possible. But instead of the 4th Washington had been expected, there were only half that number, and the men were in more wretched condition even than Washington's ranks. When Lee had complained of his troops having no shoes, it had been no duration for effect. General Heath would later write of troops passed through Peekskill, many so destitute of shoes that the blood left on the ground in many places marked the route they had taken. One of those who had made the was Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins in a letter headed Buckingham in Pennsylvania, December 20, 1776. Hodgkin reported to his wife, Sarah, we have been on the march since the 29th of last month, and we are now within 10 or 12 miles of George Washington's army. We expect here tonight, but how long we shall stay there, I can't tell. Neither can I tell you much about the enemy, only that they are on one side of the Delaware River, and our army is on the other. They had marched about 200 miles, Hodgkin thought, and the way was dangerous, the enemy being near, but also much of the country was full of them cursed creatures called Tories, the British soldiers that were faithful to King George. General Gates, too, arrived, but to Washington's disappointment, he had with him only 600. For Baltimore, Congress had named Robert Morris to head the committee to look after affairs in Philadelphia, by now an all but abandoned city. Writing to Morris 3 days before Christmas, Washington said he thought the enemy was 2 events only before marching on Philadelphia: message and the dissolution of the poor remains of our debilitated army. As near as could be considered, or as near as could be determined, Washington now had an army of about 7,500, but that was only a paper. Possibly 6,000 were fit for duty. Hundreds were sick and suffering from the cold. Morris and others in and around Philadelphia were doing everything possible in blankets, while more and more of the local citizenry were signing the British proclamation. Congress had fled. 2 former members of the Congress, Joseph Galloway and Andrew Allen, had gone over to the enemy, but by all reasonable signs it was over, and the Americans had lost. Yet for all the troubles that had beset him, all the high expectations and illusions that he had seen shattered since the triumph at Boston, Washington had more strength to draw upon than met the eye. In his own inner resources and in the ability of those still with him, and resolved to carry on. Greene, Sterling, and Sullivan, he had field commanders as good or better than any. Though Greene has best, and the very able Joseph Reed had let him down, both had learned from the experience, just as Washington had, and were more determined than ever to prove themselves in his eyes. Greene, as he would confide to his wife, was extremely happy to have again the full confidence of His Excellency. Confidence that seemed to increase the more difficult and distressing our affairs grew. Had novice artillerymen no longer, and the steadfast John Glover would be counted on. In recognition of the part played thus far by the 26-year-old Knox, Washington had already recommended him for promotion to the rank of brigadier general. Junior officers and soldiers in the ranks of Hotchkins were battered, weary, ready as beggars, but not beaten. Washington himself was by no means beaten. If William Howe and others of like the war was over and the British had won, Washington did not. Washington refused to see it that way. With Lee gone and Congress entrusting him, checking my technology for a second. With Lee gone and Congress entrusting him with more power, Washington was fully the commander now, and it suited him. Out of adversity, he seemed to draw greater energy and determination. His Excellency George Washington wrote Greene letter, never appeared to so much advance as in the hour of distress. His health was excellent. Those he counted on was stronger than ever. On December 4th, day before Christmas, Washington Judge Advocate Colonel William Tudor wrote again, as he often had during the campaign, to tell his fiancée Boston of his continuing love for her and to explain why his hopes of returning to Boston had vanished. I cannot desert, and it would certainly be desertion in a court of honor, who had deserved everything to defend his country. And whose fortune, among 10,000 others, is that a large part of it wants spirit and itself. Bristol, Pennsylvania, was a small town on the western side of the Delaware, downstream from Trenton, a river from Burlington, New Jersey. It was from Bristol, who was helping to organize Pennsylvania militia, that Joseph Reed had written a remarkable letter to Washington dated December 22nd. It was time something was done, something aggressive and surprising, Reed wrote. Even failure would be preferable to doing nothing. It's possible, my dear General, for our troops or some part of them to act with advantage to make a diversion or something more at or about Trenton. The greater the alarm, the more likely success and the attacks. I will not disguise my own cause as desperate and hopeless. If we do not take the opportunity of the collection of troops at present strike some stroke, our affairs are ruined if we do not retrieve them by some happy event. Delay with us is now equal to total defeat. Apparently, the letter was unsolicited. What was remarkable, the degree to which it corresponded with Washington's own plans. In the bleak days after the Battle of Brooklyn, Washington had told Congress, we should on all occasions avoid a general action or put anything to the risk propelled by necessity. But he had also written of the possibility of some brilliant stroke to save the cause. On December 14th, he had Trumbull that a lucky blow against the enemy would certainly rouse the spirits of the people, which are quite sunk by fortunes. Now, compelled by necessity, stroke worked out in his mind, he was ready to put almost everything. With Greene and a few others at the Buckingham headquarters, he had begun plans for days, insisting on the strictest secrecy. But on December 24th, had written to say he had heard an attack across the Delaware was being prepared, and that he had hoped it was true. Responding now to Reed, Washington confirmed that an attack on Trenton was to begin Christmas night. For heaven's sake, keep this to yourself, as this event may prove fatal to us. But necessity, dire necessity, will, nay, must justify an attempt. On Christmas Eve, Washington called a meeting to go over the final details. The army was to attack across the Delaware at 3 places. A force of 1,000 Pennsylvania militia and some 500 veteran Rhode Island troops, led by General John Cadwalader and Joseph Reed, were to cross downriver at Bristol and advance toward Burlington. A smaller force of 700 Pennsylvania under General James Ewing was to attack directly across the river at Trenton Bridge over Assunpink creek at the foot of Queens, which the enemy might use as an escape route. The third and much largest 2,400 of the Continental Army, led by Washington, Greene, Sullivan, and Sterling, would cross the Delaware 9 miles upstream from Trenton and McConkey's Ferry. Once over the river, Washington's army, south and halfway to Trenton, divided into two columns, one led by Sullivan, taking the river road, and the other commanded by Greene, taking the Pennington road further inland. 4 of Knox's cannons were to advance at the head of each column. Washington would ride with Greene. According to the latest intelligence, the enemy's forces at Trenton numbered between 2,000 and 3,000 men. The first step for midnight, December 25th, Christmas night. By marching through the night, the two columns were to arrive at Trenton no later than 5 in the morning. The attack was set for 6, an hour before daylight. Officers were to have a piece of white paper in their hat to distinguish them. Absolute secrecy was demanded. A silence was to be observed, the orders read, and no man to quit his reign of death. Christmas Day, the weather turned ominous. It is now. A northeast storm was gathering. The river filled with broken sheets of ice. In the course of the day, Joseph Reed arrived from Bristol, accompanied by Congressman and physician Benjamin Rush, who, since the adjournment of Congress, had reported to Reed and called Walder to volunteer his services. Years later, Rush would recall a private meeting with Washington in which Washington seemed much depressed. In affecting terms, he described the state of the army. As they talked, Washington kept writing something with his pen on small pieces of paper. When one of them fell to the floor by Rush's foot, he said, "He has written, victory or death." It was to be the password for the night. When Rush, the general, not to expect very much from the militiamen, called Cadwalader, I'm pronouncing it wrong, patched out a note that he asked Rush to take to Cadwalader as possible. "I am determined, as the night is favored, to cross the river and make an attack on Trenton in the morning. If you could do nothing real, at least create as great a diversion as possible." The crossing of Washington was to be made in the big-bottomed, high-sided Durham boats, as they were known, normally used on the Delaware from the Durham Iron Works near you. Painted black and pointed at both ends, they were 40 feet long with a beam of 8 feet. The biggest of them could carry as many as 40 men standing up and fully loaded. They drew only about 2 feet and so could be brought close shore. The oars or sweeps used to propel the boats were 18 feet. Henry Knox was to organize and direct the crossing, and the biggest, most difficult part of the task, as he knew, would be transporting 18 field cannons and 50 horses or more, including those of the officers. Against Brooklyn, John Glover and his men were in boats. Before leaving his headquarters to lead the march, Washington, in what seemed to have been a state of perfect calm, wrote to Robert Morris, "I agree with you that it's vain to ruminate upon or reflect upon the authors of our present misfortunes. We should rather exert ourselves, look forward with hope that some lucky chance may yet turn up in our favor." Drums rolled camps and started at about 2 in the afternoon, and they out for the river, each man carrying 60 rounds of ammunition and food enough for 3 days. It was nearly dark when the first troops reached McConkey's Ferry, where the boats waited. Henry's unmistakable bass voice could be heard, bellowing orders above the rising wind. To one account, had it not been for the powerful lungs and extraordinary exertions of the crossing that night would have failed. Ralph later praised the heroic efforts of Glover and his men, described how ice in the river made their labor almost, and the almost infinite difficulty they had getting cannons on board the boats. The Delaware was not so broad at McConkey's Ferry as at Trenton or below Trenton, where it was a tidal estuary. Under normal circumstances, the width of the river at McConkey's Ferry was about 800 feet, but with water as high as it was that night, the distance was greater by 50 feet or more, and the current strong. The ice formidable, and all accounts attest. Glover's men used oars and poles to get the across the river. The troops went standing, packed on board as close as possible. Used oars Washington crossed early and watched the slow process Jersey side. About 11 o'clock, the storm struck, a full-blown nor'easter. Among the most vivid first-hand accounts of that night was that of John Greenwood, the young fifer from Boston, who after the March to New York in April had been sent off to serve in Canada and had only just rejoined Washington's army. Fifes not being a priority under the circumstances, 16-year-old Greenwood carried a musket like every other man in one of the first boats. Over the river and went in a flat-bottomed scow, he wrote, and we had to wait for the rest and to pull down fences and make fires to warm ourselves, for the storm was increasingly rapidly. After a while, it rained, hailed, snowed, and froze, and at the same time blew a perfect hurricane, so much so that I perfectly recollect, after putting the rails on to burn, the wind and the fire would cut them in two in a moment, and when I turned my face back would be freezing. However, by turning myself around and around, I kept from perishing. As during the escape from Brooklyn, Washington's other daring river, crossing by night, a nor'easter was again decisively a blessing and a curse. A blessing in that it covered the crossing, a curse in that with the ice on the river, it was badly slowing progress when time was of the essence. The plan was to have the whole no later than midnight in order to reach Trenton by dawn. According to Washington, it was 3 o'clock, 3 hours behind schedule, before the last of the troops, horses, and cannons were across. At that point, the attack might have been called off. The men sent back the river, since the entire plan rested on the element of surprise, and the chances for surprise now seemed gone. It was a decision that could not be delayed and involved great either way. Washington decided without hesitation, as he would explain succinctly to John Hancock. Well, I knew we could not reach it. It was fairly broke. But as I was certain there was making a retreat without being discovered and harassed or repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events. Downstream, as he had no way of knowing, the other part of his plan was failing badly. General Ewing had called off his attack on Trenton because of the ice in the river. At Bristol, where ice was piled higher even than Trenton, Cadwalader and Reed had succeeded in getting some of their troops over to the other side, but unable to move their cannon across too, they had called off the attack. It was as severe a night as I ever saw, wrote an officer with Cadwalader, and after 2 battalions were landed, the storm increased so much so that it was impossible to get the artillery over, for we had to walk 100 yards on the ice to get on the shore. General Cadwalader therefore ordered the whole to retreat again, and we had to stand at least 6 hours under arms, first to cover the landing until all the rest had retreated again. And by this time, the storm of wind, rain, hail, and snow was so bad that some of the infantry could not get back till the next day. Unable to recross the ice with their weight, and another officer chose to stay on the New Jersey side, concealed in the front of a house. And thus, of the 3 planned attacks on the enemy, only one was moving forward, perilously behind schedule. The march south from McConkey's Ferry was for many the most harrowing part of the night. The storm grew worse with cold driving rain, sleet, violent hail. The troops, as Henry Knox wrote, pushed most profound silence. For the first half mile of the more dark road from the ferry was a steep uphill climb. At 2 miles, the road dropped into a ravine and crossed Jacob's Creek. Joel remembered moving no faster than a child could walk, stopping frequently and suffering terribly from the cold. I recollect very well that at one time when we halted on the road, I sat down on a tree and was so benumbed cold that I wanted to go to sleep. Had I been passed unnoticed, I should to death without even knowing it. And so the night, 2 of the men did freeze to death. There was a light to see by. A few men carried lanterns mounted on some of the cannon. The entire 2,400 on the march kept together as far as little crossroads called Birmingham, where the army divided. Sullivan's column keeping to the right on the river road, while Washington's and Greene's force veered off to the left on Pennington Road. Both were slick with ice and snow. The distance to Trenton was the same miles. Men and horses kept slipping and skidding in the dark. A Connecticut lieutenant, Westwick, remembered Washington coming along on his horse, telling the men in a solemn voice, "Keep up with your officers. For God's sake, keep up with your officers." When his army had marched out of Boston heading for New York in their first field of battle, the commander-in-chief had traveled by coach. Much of the time since, he had conducted the war from established headquarters in elegant houses. And though he had been with the army the night of the escape from Brooklyn and through the retreat across New Jersey, until now he had never been with them as a field commander on the attack. When he handed a message from General Sullivan saying that the guns too soaked to fire, Washington answered, "Tell the general to use the bayonet." None but the first officers knew where we were going or what we were about, John Greenwood wrote. This was not unusual, however, as I have never heard soldiers say anything, nor ever saw them trouble themselves as to where they were or where they were being led. It was enough for them to know that wherever the officers commanded, they must go. For it was all the same, owing to the possibility of being in a worse condition than their present one, and therefore the men always like to be kept moving in expectation themselves. The two columns reached their assigned position outside of Trenton at the same time, a few minutes before 8, an hour after daylight. Trenton was referred to as a pretty village, which was an exaggeration, with perhaps 100 houses, an Episcopal church, a marketplace, and 2 or 3 iron furnaces. It was in peaceful times a busy but plain little place of no particular consequence, except it was at the head of navigation on the river and a stop on the King's Highway from New York to Philadelphia. There was also a stone barracks built during the French and Indian War, bridge over Assunpink Creek below town. The principal streets were King Street, which ran parallel toward the river, sloping downward from the point above town where the Pennington Road and the King's Highway converged. Washington's plan of attack at this point, the head of the King-Queen Street, sighed the day. In the early light of December 26th and the white blur of the continuing storm, it was difficult to distinguish much of anything about Trenton. Most of the townspeople had fled, taking as much as possible of their belongings. In the bare houses, the stone barracks, were quartered the 1,500 Hessians who occupied the town. The commander, Colonel Rawle, had established a frame house on King Street, the home of an owner of an iron furnace, Stacy Potts, who was happy to have the colonel as his guest. Johann Gottlieb Rawle was a sturdy, able career soldier, and at an age of 56, a senior among officers. The command had been conferred in recognition of his valor at White Plains and Fort Washington. He was a man of limitation. He spoke little or no English and had only contempt for the rebel army. His pleasures were a game of cards, a good drink or two, and martial music, which he relished to the point of marching himself with his military band at almost any excuse. Rawle would be roundly criticized later by some of his junior officers for being lazy, lax, indifferent to the possibility of a surprise attack, and a drunkard. Captain Johann Ewald, as fair-minded as any Hessian officer who served in America, later wrote that many who criticized Rawle after his death were not fit to have carried his sword. Harassed by rebel patriots that kept coming over the Delaware, Rawle had established outposts beyond the town and insisted that each night one company sleep with their muskets ready to be called out at a moment's notice. And they were called out. It seemed to some more often. If anything, the colonel was thought to be too much on edge. An officer complained in his diary, "We have not slept one night in peace since we came to the place." It was the size of the attack to come, and in such weather, that Rawle did not anticipate. And in this, he was not alone. Before departing for New York, General Howe had put Grant in overall command of outposts in New Jersey. Grant was at Brunswick, 25 miles from Trenton. On December 24th, he received certain intelligence that the rebels were planning attack on Trenton. While he did not think them it, he alerted Rawle, telling him to be on guard. Rawle received the message at 5 o'clock the afternoon. Not long after, a dozen Hessians on guard on the road beyond town were fired on in the dark by an American patrol, which had quickly withdrawn. Rawle himself, out through the storm to look things over, concluded that this was the attack that he had been warned about. On such a night, he assumed more would happen. Later in the Raul attended a small Christmas gathering at a local merchant and was playing cards when a servant interrupted to deliver still another warning message that had been delivered to the door by an unknown loyalist, and this Raul is thrust into his pocket. It is not known what time he returned to his quarters or whether, as later said, he had too much to drink. The attack began just after 8 o'clock. The Americans under Nathanael Greene came out and across the field through driving snow half a mile from town. They were moving fast at what was called a long trot. Hessians on guard on the Pennington Road had trouble at first making out who they were and how many they were. The storm continued with great violence, Henry Knox wrote, but was at our backs and consequently in the faces of the enemy. The Americans opened fire. The Hessians waited for them to get closer, then fired, and then quickly, smoothly falling down, exactly as they had been trained to do when retreat was the only choice. Washington thought they performed particularly well, keeping up a steady, retreating fire. As Greene and Sullivan's columns converged on the town, Washington moved to high ground nearby on the north, where he tried to keep watch on what was happening. His 2,400 Americans had been on their feet all night, wet, cold, their weapons, as if everything depended on them. Each man seemed to vie with the other in pressing forward, Washington wrote. In town, the Hessians came rushing out of their houses and barracks into the streets. Drum beat, the band played, officers shouted orders in German, and as fast as the Hessians began forming up, his artillery were in position at the head of King and Queen streets. And an open fire with deadly effect, down hundreds in minutes, in the twinkling of an eye, Knox said, cleared the streets. When the Hessians retreated into the side streets, they found some coming at them with fixed guns. For a brief time, Americans and Hessians were locked in savage house fighting, and it was all happening extremely fast. Wild confusion, snow made more blinding by clouds of gunpowder and smoke. The storm of nature and the storm of the town, wrote Nathanael Greene, exhibited a scene that filled the mind, passions easier conceived than described. When the Hessians rolled out a gun midway on King Street, a half-dozen Virginians, led by Captain William Washington, a distant cousin of the commander, and Lieutenant James Monroe, rushed forward, seized it, and turned it on them. Colonel Raul, who had been roused from his bed and was quickly on horseback and into the fray, ordered a charge. Men were being hit all around him. The line faltered. He ordered a retreat at the southeast edge of town. Then Raul, too, was hit and fell from his horse. Mortally wounded, he was picked up and carried to the Potts house. The Hessians in the orchard, finding themselves surrounded, lay down their arms and surrendered. It all happened in 45 minutes or less. 21 Hessians had been killed, 90 wounded. The prisoners taken numbered approximately 900. 500, most of them by the bridge over a Some Pink Creek. Incredibly, in a battle of such extreme savagery, only 4 Americans had been wounded, including Captain Washington and Lieutenant Monroe, and not one American had been. The only American fatigued with the 2 soldiers who had frozen to death during the night. After having marched off the prisoners and in stores, wrote Knox, we returned to the place 9 miles where we had embarked. Thus, after marching through the night a second to McConkey's Ferry, the Army crossed the Delaware once again back to the Pennsylvania side. And that is how, my friends, we won the Revolutionary War. Yay! So that's the reading. I'm glad for the people who were able to watch this live, but also now, if you are interested in receiving a copy of this video, send an email to gwashington1636@gmail.com, and I will happily send you a copy of this, because I want our true history, our won battles, our victories to be known by every single man, woman, and child in our world. We have much to be grateful for this Christmas season, and one of them is the battle of the brave soldiers and all the people who suffered and fought during the Revolutionary War. So with that, I Merry Christmas, God bless, and have a wonderful Christmas and spread this far and wide on all your streams. And also, too, please join us for our common law class at patreon.com. Search for the Willis School of Freedom and start your journey to your personal freedom today.